for all the fun and strategy you can gather from a card game, they definitely provide entirely different experiences across games. More than just across different ban lists and formats, but across the very groundwork and systems they utilize. But haven't you ever wanted to unleash the raw power of Blue Eyes White Dragon in Magic, or throw fireballs in Yu-Gi-Oh? What lengths do we have to go through to marry whole gameplay structures completely alien to each other? How far must we go? Well, that's what we'll try to answer today on Card Connection. Hello everyone and welcome to Card Connection, the show where we transcend gameplay systems to connect your favorite card games together. Glad you could join me. Today, in our inaugural episode, we're looking at a thought experiment I brewed up together. After playing enough Master Duel between 45-minute turns and Commander, I wondered, what would I have to do to turn the 6 Samurai True King deck into Magic's next top competitor? Actually, it was more of a question of whether this was actually possible or not, and what I'd have to do in the world of Magic the Gathering to make these cards a reality. To answer that question, I sorted my deck list of 55, 40 main deck and 15 extra, into a few categories ranging from easiest to convert to most difficult, and I hope that through showing this process, we can truly understand what each of these systems are capable of. But before all of that, a quick overview of the deck so you understand how it plays and what we're trying to build around here. True King 6 Samurai is an explosive combo deck that aims to abuse the unique interaction between 6 Samurai Fuma and the True King monsters. By using Fuma as fuel for True King summons, this translates into tens of free Samurai summons over the course of a turn. These summons turn into monsters from your extra deck that not only draw more cards over the turn, but almost always finds you a way to one of the most abusable cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history: Gateway of the Six. Your free Samurai summons segue into searches for supplemental swordsmen to further your strategy to end on a squad of swell soldiers. Best case scenario, you have access to basically every monster in your deck and can end on a comical amount of effect negation. That best case is about 65% of the time, but win rate's not really pertinent to the video. And we'll touch on a few ground rules for how I handle the conversions in terms of the card stats. For monsters, the attributes translated pretty cleanly to Magic colors: light to white, dark to black, fire to red, water to blue, and earth to green. Wind was a little more different and wasn't as clean of a conversion, so that was on a case-by-case basis for the monsters. Monster levels became the mana values in Magic, and the attack and defense values roughly translated by dividing the Yu-Gi-Oh stats by 500. Some bend this rule, but this was the general guideline. Creature types translated pretty cleanly as well, with most of the 6 Samurai turning to Samurai Warriors, and card types like Tuner, XYZ, and Synchro just added onto type lines. Spell cards translated pretty cleanly as well. Normal spells became sorceries, equip spells became equipment artifacts, continuous and field spells became different types of enchantments. Traps aren't in the deck at all, and honestly, they probably deserve their own video to talk about a deck involved with it and how I would go about converting them. So starting from the easiest to convert over, Tutors and Counter Generators. I think by far the easiest cards to convert in the deck were all of the cards that search other cards from the deck. This includes Reinforcement of the Army, Sheep Smoke Signal, and Terraforming. The former two remained tribal sorceries in green, as green is generally the creature searcher, as well as the tribal theme I thought could work well for other conversions down the road. Terraforming was baited to green and white, partly for thematic reasons to make it green, and partly for the game reasons, as white tends to be the enchantment searching color. The counter cards in the main deck that gathered Bushido counters were also about as easy to translate: 6 Samurai United, Shien's Dojo, Temple of the Six, and the aforementioned Gateway of the Six. All of them, save for Temple, needed some additional text. Magic system works more with card effects with instant speed as the default, whereas Yu-Gi-Oh needs to preface effects with quick effect. United needed some additional text to emphasize the 2 counter limit, and Gateway had some formatting that was required. Temple is the first example of a world enchantment, the equivalent to old school Yu-Gi-Oh field spells, mechanics and all, and a card type Magic has not revisited in quite some time. Next, we have simple creatures and extenders. To start, Shan Squire was mostly just changing words around. Damage calc in Magic is done after blocks are declared, and the short invulnerability had to be noted that it goes away at the end of combat. Originally, I just wanted to give the monster indestructible and do away with the complexity, but that kind of goes against the whole point of this exercise. But besides the monkey, the rest of these extender monsters were fairly straightforward. Mizuho and Shinai are husband and wife in the lore, so they come to each other's aid for free. Kizan and his older counterpart, the Grandmaster, can bring themselves out for free as long as there's another samurai in your field. The most complex of these extenders was Kageki. Summons in Magic have to be translated to enters the battlefield, but normal summons needed further explanation. Kageki gets his effect from a normal summon, and I thought the best way to change this to Magic text was that he had to be cast from the hand to get this effect. This also is an example of the Wind conundrum where there's no clean color conversion. I made him green and blue given the creature focus, and other color combinations don't quite allow for free creatures from the hand without some drawback of some degree. Black or white would have to be from the graveyard, and red would imply something more aggressive or a more live fast, die young type effect. The last extender, Legendary Secret of the Six Samurai, admittedly needed some funkier card text than the rest. While Yu-Gi-Oh! Can cherry-pick individual stats of cards to copy, Magic just copies the entire front face of a card and then wrangles it from there. In my initial draft, I thought it'd be cool if it would just copy the whole card. But then I realized not only does this drift too far from my goal, it also creates a lot of situations that just wouldn't happen in Yu-Gi-Oh! Things like copying a Shinai to make Mizuho live, copying Fuma because if it dies you'll get the destroyed effect. These are all cool, but it's my goal to do a one-to-one conversion rather than make creative edits. Luckily, I was able to retain this copy idea to still make the Yu-Gi-Oh! Mechanic work, but I had to work out a way to copy only the stats and the mana value. Magic has ways to retain names. I stole some templating from Sakashima the Imposter to do that. As for the mana value, Magic has a very firm, not in this house rule, on modifying mana values of permanents in play. So to keep that, I still had to copy the exiled creature. But through all this, I was a little stumped as to how I could get it to just ignore the effects. So, the cleanest way I could think of was to just have it lose all other abilities after it copies. Generally a bad thing because you want your cards to do the thing they say they do, but in theory, at least I think, because Magic's layer system is genuinely a nightmare, it would effectively mimic the Yu-Gi-Oh! Effect and allow it to only copy the level, attack, defense, and color. The Secret Six Samurai is where we start reaching more main deck complexity, though it's more the ward count for some than others. Fuma is particularly important as it's another wind monster caught in the color conundrum, but as I explained before, it's very important to the deck's combos. At first, you start as green, then white, then a hybrid of green and white. Then I realized just how integral it is to the deck and how he needs to be able to be destroyed by every single True King. So, he costs green-white hybrid because those are the most prevalent colors of the casting costs, but he's also treated as all colors. If he wasn't so integral to the functioning of the deck, I'd have made him green or green-white, but it needs to be this way for the specific verbiage. Kizaru was made a little wordy for two reasons. One, his special summon condition, and two, the specifics in how he searches the deck. I was able to invert Kizaru's specifics for the first, and for the second it was about a word-for-word conversion of his Yu-Gi-Oh! Text, but in the context of creature color instead of attributes. Hatsume had a pretty straightforward effect, as several cards in Magic like Young Necromancer have similarly worded costs and effects for creature resurrection. But the big element tying these three together is their protection effect. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a lot more liberal with effects that can outright destroy monsters and has more protection for destruction outside of combat. Magic is very cut and dry with its protection. Hexproof and Shroud prevents the targeting in the first place, Indestructible is, well, it makes the thing indestructible, but Destruction Replacement has not shown up that much. The issue is that Magic doesn't do this sort of combat invulnerability too often. It admittedly took a long time to get worded correctly, until I landed on the condition of the effect that it can't be used during combat. So I got the timing down, but what kind of protection does this give? Again, further, stranger wording was used prior, but Magic used to use a keyword called regeneration, where if the creature would die, it would be protected from it instead. So from there, regeneration seemed to be the perfect fit for this kind of protection effect in Yu-Gi-Oh! To translate over. Finally, the last main deck card, for now, Moon Mirror Shield. This gets a section all to its own because it's a decently repeated effect in Yu-Gi-Oh! Across cards like Honest and Prideful Roar, but there hasn't been anything quite like this in Magic. There's cards that boost stats, but there's nothing that explicitly makes your stats equal in such a very, very specific situation. Yu-Gi-Oh!, like aggro players, has the benefit of not having to deal with such blocker math and can instead just punch across the table with impunity. Therefore, converting Moon Mirror Shield went through a few different wordings of the effect. Originally, it was pretty much just like Yu-Gi-Oh!, including a +1 to reference the greater power and toughness, but then I realized, Magic has that layer system. In short, it dictates how certain effects resolve on permanence. Most of the time it comes up in discussions, it's about how Blood Moon broke your kneecaps and stole your family fortune. Today, it'll help us perform the Moon Mirror Shield stat mimic +1 effect. The static +1/+1 gives you the small boost, and then you get the major boost during combat to just edge out your opponent. Though I think the biggest toss-up was its mana cost and equip cost, something you don't really have to consider about Yu-Gi-Oh!, but obviously something integral to Magic's systems. Unfortunately, it strikes an awkward balance no equipment really wants to be in. It appears to be too broken at a lower mana cost, but not good enough at a higher cost. So I just decided to skirt the middle, go for a 3 mana actual cast and a 2 mana equip. Probably the part of the video Yu-Gi-Oh! Fans were waiting for the most. What did I do with the extra deck? You know, that little bit off to the side that's radically changed the way Yu-Gi-Oh's been played since 2008. My answer, I didn't make a dedicated deck for it. As nice as that would be, I wanted to use this to see if the cards were even viable to be made. That, and Magic tried having cards on the side readily accessible during the main game, and it broke Standard, and Modern, and debatably Vintage, depending on what your opinion of cats are. So yeah, we're just sticking with ways to convert the extra deck summons to Magic. In this deck we have Synchro, XYZ, and Link, all of which have text that amounts to they only get the cool effect if you summon them with their proper summoning method. Synchro is probably the most straightforward. You get some creatures, you get a tuner, their combined mana value adds up to the monster you want to summon, send them all away, and you get a new creature. It's like a merge, but in reverse. Cloud Castle is pretty straightforward, though in the first draft I just copied the can't attack when they enter a wholesale effect. But I turned to the archetype cycle from Born from the Gods as a way to correctly word the attack prevention ability. Arcathese was pretty cut and dry, albeit still needing a handful of text for its on-summon draw effect. Shien was pretty intense for not only having the more specific Synchro cast, but also the two very particular effects on him. The spell trap negation templating was taken from Neon Dynasty's Jin-Gitaxias, with triggering once each turn, but you have the choice to counter it rather than it being just an automatic ability. The protection effect was taken wholesale from Yu-Gi-Oh! Initially, before I realized that damage remains marked on creatures until the end of the turn, state-based effects means that Shien would still be destroyed. Yu-Gi-Oh's method just wouldn't work here. So I realized I could use the same regeneration idea the Secret Six Samurai used by sacrificing Samurai instead to mimic a similar effect in Magic. Xyz, despite being the third extra summoning mechanic introduced, is in my opinion still the most straightforward. You use some amount of monsters, usually 2, that share at minimum the same level, and at maximum some ungodly amount of shared attributes and exceptions. Luckily, the most complex that we get here was 2 Samurai for Shadow of the Six Samurai, but the magic complexity comes in with the materials that technically remain as part of the monster after the summon. Where do they go? They're not in the field, nor in the graveyard. But I decided to take the imprint mechanic, which would exile cards underneath another card for the XYZ Monsters. Because they'd remember the cards exiled under them, it would know what cards were used as material, and therefore what cards could actually get returned to the graveyard. Out of these, I think Levier is the coolest because of its interaction with exiled creatures that I think has very little precedent in Magic. Returning any exiled creature to your battlefield would offer a wide amount of utility. Funnily, Levier was also a victim of which colors win anyway, so I decided to make it white and blue because of the pair's close ties with exiling and returning creatures. The most complex to figure out was Phantom Fortress Enter Blathnir, a name that could only imply a mortgage loan of card text, which is partly true. Before I decided to condense it, I had each effect on its own line with the sorcery speed restriction, leading to a pretty significant text length. But I realized I could copy similar spells that have you choose a mode and work off from there. And finally, we reach Link Monsters. The conception of Links was to try and slow down the game, nerf some decks that overly relied on the extra deck. This didn't quite work out, but the pertinent piece of the conversion are those red arrows. In Yu-Gi-Oh, the arrows point to physical monster zones that you can summon more Link monsters to, or previously other extra deck monsters. Obviously in Magic, we have an issue. Magic doesn't really have subdivided zones in the same way that Yu-Gi-Oh does. Like, okay, look at the mats. We have a graveyard, we have a deck, some removed from the game area, but Magic just has this DMZ of cards go here. So, for those of you hoping I finagled something with this, yeah, I didn't. In Yu-Gi-Oh, there's a strategic decision for which extra deck monster zone you start linking from, and where you need to place monsters such that you have opportune link zones. This element is just completely non-existent in Magic. This takes out some of the strategy, but also debatably makes the link monsters just overall stronger in general. Saryuya, for instance, can't give opponent monster stats and instead just buffs your own board. Battle Shogun gets counters whenever a samurai enters instead of just specifically under its link points, further enabling potential infinite loops using Gateway. I think the neatest innovation I did though was how the link summons actually work. Much like how the link value represents the physical defense location on Yu-Gi-Oh cards, I used the creature's toughness to represent the link ability. There were a few variants that got made for the actual link summon, though I think the keywords could have been a bit more explicit and definitely the rules text could have been a little less lengthy, but for what it has to do, given explaining the link rating contributing to summons, I think it's workable. Though I'm more surprised after figuring out the link mechanic how simple some of the effects were to convert over. Isolde is surprisingly clean to translate to Magic and is partly the reason why most of the creatures have Warrior as subtypes. Nightmare Phoenix came across pretty cleanly even with the removal of link arrows. Appaloosa and Access Code have some weird interpretations, mostly because they both happen to have restrictions about what happens with the stack. I pulled some formatting ideas from Lightning Storm to implement their particular wording. Appo needed some even weirder wording, gaining -1/-0 text a la old school Cards from the Dark. Access Code needed a whole paragraph to properly translate, needing to exile different attribute link monsters to pay for its effect. Finally, of course, I had to make a version that uses the maximum gold alternate artwork for Appaloosa. But this is not quite the end. We still have one more section of card to go over. We've reached, in my opinion, the most difficult cards to work out. The True Kings and Draconic Diagram. Links, you can get away with removing link arrows because it's just not a part of the game. You can't quite escape having to destroy cards in the hand. You can argue this could have been a discard effect. I counter that with 1. The Fuma interaction being so integral to the strategy, and 2. That will create unintentional interactions with discard that don't even exist in Yu-Gi-Oh!, i.e. Madness, which I truly wanted to avoid. The Fuma interaction on its own made me change Marame to be part white, actually. So as much as I wanted to try finagling magic text, I just made another keyword and noted that the cards destroyed in hand would trigger their dies triggers. Sometimes you just have to bite the bullets. The most quote-unquote fun king to convert was Lithosogem, mostly because its effect as written would only be able to exile cards from the sideboard because there's no extra deck in Magic, and I really wanted to keep it as is, but at that point I think it starts conflicting with actual game rules and what you can actually interact with. So again, biting the bullet and change the effect to exile cards in the graveyard. Bearstros had a bit of a conundrum to deal with. Spells and traps in the context of Magic is basically applying to everything that's not a creature, which asks the question if it's okay to exile lands. I initially thought, sure, you're probably never going to have 2 blue creatures to blow up, but I decided the edge case of having something exile 2 lands and you get a huge creature for 0 casting cost, while in the spirit of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is not really what it did in Yu-Gi-Oh! So it got slightly downgraded so it couldn't exile lands. Draconic Diagram was fun to make, mostly to finagle the whole stuff destroyed in hand is like if it's destroyed on field. The challenge was again though, how to handle very particular battle protection. I thought to use the new shield counters from New Capenna for the sake of something new, but after including it in the script and already acquiescing several abilities for balance reasons, this cop-out was just not going to cut it. Funnily enough though, the changes I made to Synchro Shien with Regeneration was what saved me here, as Regeneration mid-combat was much closer to Draconic Diagram's original design intent. Through this specific verbiage, battle protection is still there, but in the frame of Magic this also allows for protection from combat tricks or other random destruction effects mid-combat as well. And finally, we have the very fun dragon, VFD, the true king of all calamities. Once I had the alternate summoning down, I just had to convert the effect negation, which was a little difficult in and of itself. Though it turns out the best way to change color was to use Painter's Servant as a template, though the second part still needed to take some verbiage from Yu-Gi-Oh! In terms of in the opponent's possession, though I was able to borrow some formatting from Masquid Nexus when it came to explaining what happens with creatures not currently on the battlefield. So, there we have it. I feel this was a pretty good first attempt at connecting the labyrinth and card text that is Yu-Gi-Oh! To a completely different system. I have some ideas for where to take this series, mostly a second parter, for instance, where we would actually duel with the converted cards against other real-life Magic decks, but I'd be curious for what other directions you think the series should go in next. Leave your thoughts down below, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and I'll see you next time with more Card Connection.